I'm a small L libertarian and a registered Republican because the Republican Party has views, policies that are closer to the policies and views that I have. But my goodness, Thomas Sowell once said that Republicans' favorite exercise is running for the hills. And I've been on radio as I've seen, for example, George W. Bush, or George Herbert Walker Bush, rather, start the Americans with Disabilities Act he signed. Horrible intrusion on private business, mandating that businesses do this and that and this to accommodate the handicapped. Not that that's a bad thing, obviously, but government shouldn't be mandating this, for crying out loud. And George W. Bush signed the S-CHIP program to expand health care for children of a certain income level. I'm sure that's all wonderful, but it's not government's business. So I've sat and I've watched as Republicans have expanded government. I've seen as Republicans have signed the so-called highway bill, full of all sorts of so-called pork. I say so-called pork because they keep calling it different things, earmarks, this, that, and the other. It's ridiculous that I should be paying for a road in somebody else's state and vice versa. It's insane. Both parties love doing the highway bill, though, full of all sorts of goodies they can give to their constituents and say, I did this and I did that. Completely antithetical to what the Founding Fathers intended. Even the interstate highway that Dwight Eisenhower built, you know the rationale for that? It was not commerce, even though obviously it benefited the country commercially. The rationale was defense. Look at the name of the act under which the interstate highway was built. The Defense Authorization something, something, something. That's the rationale. Otherwise, at the time anyway, the feeling was the government did not have the legal authority to do this. And believe it or not, much of the New Deal was stricken down by the Supreme Court, sometimes unanimously. The Supreme Court said, this may be real wonderful, all these farm programs and this program and that program, but the Commerce Clause didn't allow you to do that. That's why FDR got so ticked off, and that's the model that these Democrats were parroting, got so ticked off, he was going to, quote, pack the court, close quote, with several more Supreme Court justices that would now find his New Deal policies legal. And one justice was so afraid of the precedent that this would start, he switched and began voting in favor of the New Deal. And in law school, when we read about this period of the Supreme Court, the line was, a switch in time saved 9. And by the way, the judge who switched, his last name, ironically, was Roberts. Now, getting back to what I was saying a moment ago, and I'm going to get to some new developments on the Capitol Hill storming front. And again, we're going to talk to the president's lawyer next hour, John Eastman, who's no longer affiliated with his university, with whom he has been associated with for decades after his representation of Donald Trump. Apparently, there's a lot of pressure on the dean to disassociate themselves from Mr. Eastman, even though he is a tenured professor. All of that coming up, so stick around for that. Now, one more time, I mentioned this stuff about St. Louis and about Chicago and about Baltimore, because that's really what the problem is. And see, Democrats love to tell black people how we understand about racism and how we see the racism, how we're going to deal with the racism, and how racism is affecting you. And even when blacks weren't even involved, we're going to say that you're involved anyway. We're going to say things like, well, suppose the Capitol Hill police had encountered a bunch of black people. They would have killed them all. We'll do that for you, let you know that we get how you're feeling. Meanwhile, article, Baltimore Sun. Headline, homicide is a devastating plague on black communities, and it is time we stop ignoring it. Pop, this isn't fair. What if most of the homicide victims were white? Quote, his name is John Hudgens, H-U-D-G-I-N, Hudgens, Baltimore Sun. Quote, the reality is that homicides in major cities, including Baltimore, are not race neutral. Of the more than 300 people killed in the streets of Baltimore last year, just about all of them were African Americans. The shooters, killers, were most likely black as well. This is a devastating plague acutely affecting black communities across the country, writes this man. I haven't come across the word microaggression yet. I haven't come across the word underrepresentation yet. Quote, we must realize, he continues, that some black people are a much greater threat to other black people than the KKK or the white citizens' councils. You know, liberals love telling you about white nationalism and how white nationalists are rising up. I'm born and raised in South Central. I've been on the earth now for a few decades. I don't recall seeing a single Klansman up and down my neighborhood in all those decades I lived there. Maybe I just missed it. Quote, we must realize that some black people are a much greater threat to other black people than the Ku Klux Klan or the white citizens' councils. The number of blacks gunned down in the streets by other blacks parallels our memories of the many blacks lynched in communities across the United States after Reconstruction. This is a devastating plague acutely affecting black communities across the country. I didn't write this. His name is John, Hudgins. Send your angry Uncle Tom sellout letters to him. Quote, the killings continue even as the country faces a coronavirus pandemic. Stop and frisk in New York City was associated with a decline in homicides. When Richmond, Virginia got tough on gun violations, the homicide rate went down. By allowing gun violations to be prosecuted as federal crimes, guilty persons were renditioned to federal prisons in places like Utah. That likely included some African Americans. When Baltimore mayor got tough with bad guys with guns, homicides in Baltimore went down. Many African American communities are under siege by black gun-toting terrorists, he writes. Children cannot play in their yards, and the elderly cannot sit on their porches. As a result, at a recent town hall, a young black woman could not understand why her brother's killer had remained still free on the street, awaiting trial for a previous gun violation. Many of the people accused of murder in the city frequently have existing gun violations. This is a cycle that must be broken. But I thought the man was harder on black people. I thought it went after black people. I thought... Has Joe Biden said anything about this? Has Finnegan Biden, who went to Penn, said anything about this? Has she called, Pop, this isn't fair. Suppose these homicide victims were mostly white. Wouldn't government respond differently? No one could tell me the government wouldn't respond differently if they were mostly white. Where are you? Where are you? Hey, but let's talk about microaggression. Let's talk about racism. Donald Trump, racism. Both sides in Charlottesville. Eyes bulging, torches, tiki torches.